Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mike McMahon. I'm Executive Director of the Hymn Society in the United States and Canada, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this fifth in our interview series during the lead up to our Centennial Conference. This series features Hymn Society leaders of various types, and today I am really delighted to be welcoming the Reverend Dr. Carl Daw, who is an Episcopal priest and who served before me as executive director of the Hymn Society from 1996 until 2009, while it was headquartered at Boston University School of Theology. Some of you may know the headquarters of the Hymn Society follow the executive director. So when Carl assumed this position, the headquarters were moved to Boston, and of course now we're in Washington, where I live. Attentive hymn singers will certainly recognize his name from the many marvelous hymn texts that appear in most English language hymnals today. He's taught hymnology at Boston University and at the Yale Divinity School and Institute of Sacred Music, and he continues to serve as curator of the hymnological collections at Boston University. He's not only a widely published hymn writer, but he's also a prolific author. In 2007, he was named a fellow of the Hymn Society. Over these next 45 minutes or so, I think you're going to learn a lot more about Carl and his fascinating life story. On a personal note, I can testify that one of the reasons that the Hymn Society continues to thrive today is because of the leadership of Carl and of other fine staff and EC members who have served the Hymn Society over these past 100 years. So welcome, Carl. It's good to be with you today.
Hi, Mike. Good to be with you too.
Thanks. Well, so I was wondering if you could get us started by talking a little bit about how this all started for you. I mean, your early experiences of music and ministry and singing.
Well, as I've often said, I think my experience of church music must have been prenatal, because my mother was an active singer in choirs all her life, and she must have sung to me in the womb. In any case, because my father was a Baptist minister, I was at church and singing, as I said, when I was 6 years old, twice on Sunday and not so long on Wednesday nights. So that was very much the shape of my growing up. So I can't even remember a time when I didn't sing hymns. They've always been part of my life. And even when I had my requisite rebellion during college years, it was always the hymns that would stick with me, even when I wasn't going to church. It is a very great thing that I have been able to spend so much of the last several decades fostering congregational song, because it means so much to me.
Yeah. Did you have formal training as a young person?
Well, the churches where my father served had graded choir programs, so I grew up singing in church choirs, and I also had instrumental instruction in cello and piano, and then I kind of took up organ out of necessity.
And did you play the organ in church?
I did, yes. Before I went to seminary, when I was teaching at William and Mary, my wife and I shared the music directorship of our parish, and we would take turns. One would conduct and the other would play, and the other one would play and the other one conduct, that sort of thing, back and forth on Sundays.
Now, can you say a little bit about how you met your wife?
Well, appropriately enough, I met my wife in a choir loft. We were both in a small parish outside Charlottesville, Virginia, where I was in grad school. and she was the librarian of the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. And we literally met in a choir loft. And the rest is history. So, so music, of course, has always been a part of our life.
You mentioned that your father was a Baptist minister, so a lot of your own experiences obviously were with more evangelical styles of singing and worship. And then you found your way to the Episcopal Church. Can you say a little bit about that experience?
Well, when I came back from my not going to church period, where I went to church was the Episcopal Chapel on campus. And the thing that appealed to me about it is that both faculty and students were involved there. And so it had a real sense of community about it. And also it was very musical. So that also appealed to me.
Mm-hmm. And then you mentioned then going on to grad school at the University of Virginia, and then you were a professor of English, yes?
Yes, I taught at William & Mary for 8 years before going to seminary.
Uh-huh. A big leap from professor of English to a seminarian.
Well, of course, yes. On the other hand, one of the things about it is having taught for 8 years, when I was in seminary, I could tell when my professors weren't really prepared.
A professor's worst nightmare, right?
Yes, it was one of those days. I could tell. You know it. So, but it was seminary was really important because that, in terms of hymn things, because my liturgics professor, Marianne Hatchett, was in charge of was the chair of the text committee for what became the 1982 hymnal. And I had read in a church publication about that. So I went up to him one day and said, I would like to volunteer to be on that committee. Well, I was rather naive about the ways of the church at that point, because I didn't understand that one really ought to be appointed by the presiding bishop to be on those committees. But Marian was very cordial, and he said, well, as a matter of fact, we have a meeting coming up later this month in Nashville. Why don't you come along? And we'll see how that works out. Well, I figured they thought I would be useful. Since I had a PhD in English, I could probably punctuate. So I went along, and it was a wonderful group of people, and we got on very well. And so eventually I was appointed to be a consulting member of the committee. And it was a wonderful context in which to begin to write hymns, working my way up from amending one line to doing a stanza, to doing a paraphrase, because I was always in the company of people who gave me good advice. And I really think that's the best possible way to begin to write hymns, with other people giving you feedback and not feeling out all on your own. Because without some kind of reminder of what other people will read out of what you write, you won't get very far.
That's fascinating, because we frequently get inquiries from people because they find us on the internet and they say, right, "Oh, Hymn Society. So how do I get started? How do I get started writing hymns?" And your story is really, really interesting. I mean, you found yourself in company of people who had amazing careers in this field.
Yeah, well, one of the really humbling things was that Francis Bland Tucker, was still around and was a member of that committee. And he had been a member of the committee for the 1940 hymnal. And part of what was so wonderful about Bland was he had an immense sense of humility. Even though he could have been someone who had every right to lord it over others because of his reputation, he was not like that at all. And I have so many wonderful stories. One of my favorites about Bland is that one of the things we were working on in doing the hymnal in 1982 is we were listening to the seminaries who had some things they didn't like about the theology of some of the hymns. And one of the sticking points was the word Jehovah, because the Hebrew scholars pointed out to us it's not really a Hebrew word, it's a made-up word from people who didn't understand how Hebrew was written. And so we spent, the whole committee of about 11 or 12 people, I spent an entire afternoon working on issues of how to get around Jehovah, as in guide me, O thou great. And by the end of the day, we still hadn't reached any resolution. So as we often did, we turned it over to Bland. And we said, Bland, could you work on this overnight and give us something tomorrow? Well, the next day, at that point, we were staying at a convent in Sewanee. And so we all came down to breakfast, and eventually Bland comes padding down in his house slippers and gets his cereal and so on, and sits down and doesn't say anything. And finally, we couldn't stand it. We said, okay, Bland, what did you come up with? And he said, well, I think from now on, we should sing, guide me, O thou great you know who. Which is in many ways a profound answer as well as a humorous one, because it talks about the unknowability of God and the danger of naming God. And that's just one tiny slice of what a wonderful person he was to work with. And what an inspiration to someone who was just starting out in this process.
So you wrote some of your first hymns for the hymnal 1982, did you not?
Oh, yes. Well, I as I said, I'd done emendations, a stanza here and there, and some paraphrases of canticles and things. And then we reached a point where the tunes committee that was working alongside was sifting through tunes while we were sifting through texts. And they said, here we've got this tune by Peter Cutts called Bridegroom that we really want you to have a text for in the new hymnal. And the original text that goes with, for which Peter actually wrote the tune, is just incredibly sexist. And we already had enough of those we were trying to get rid of. We didn't need to take on a new one. But it was like, as the bridegroom to his chosen, and things like as the father to the home, no mention of the mother. And so we said, we simply can't use this text. And so at that point, the committee said to me, okay, Carl, it's time for you to write a hymn. Go write a text that will work with this tune. So I went and I played during the time the committee wasn't meeting, the month in between. And I played it on the piano and the organ and practically kazoo, anything I could think of. And finally, at the end of that music, I heard the words, "Come, Holy Spirit, come." And so this eventually became Like the Murmur of the Dove Song.
Wow.
So that was my first hymn.
It's amazing. Some people work a long time to come up with a good hymn, and you knocked it out of the park your first time. That's pretty amazing. One aspect of that story that intrigues me is that how the text flowed from the tune. Mel Bringle, a couple of interviews ago, was saying that she just loves to create texts from the tunes. And
Right.
has that been your experience very frequently?
Well, it varies, but I have a very strong belief in the quality of music to say things. Um, when I was teaching at William and Mary, one of the wonderful courses I was able to devise was a course called Words in Music. And it looked at a variety of different things like ballads, where what you do when you sing is so different from just reading the words of a ballad, because when you sing it, you have all this repetition, down and down, how down and down, and it gives space to the words, the singing does, in a way that the visual contact doesn't. And we went on through a variety of other kinds of words in music, and we ended up with settings of the Requiem Mass in Latin, because there we had a stable text in a foreign language, so we could listen more carefully to what the music was doing with the text. And I really felt that I had gotten through to them when one of the students said, "I think I like the God of Foray better than the God of Verdi."
That is great.
And I said, yeah, obviously, Foray portrays a God who is gentler and kinder, that especially when you do the Dies Irae of Verdi, you got a lot of churning and not happiness there. So I'm a very strong believer in what music communicates. And I think we sing best when we are able to take the energy of the music into the energy of the text.
That really speaks to how integral the music is to the hymn. I mean, a lot of people talk about, well, the hymn is just really the text, and as though the music were something extra, but that's not really what you're saying, is it?
I have a story about that. When I was on the text committee, one Sunday I was preaching in a parish, not my own, and I had not known that the rector had put in the bulletin, Dr. Daw is on the committee for the new hymnal and will be glad to talk with you about it at the coffee hour. Well, after the service, I put on my armor and headed down to the coffee hour. And I could see this woman diagonally across from the entrance to the parish hall. It was like she was on skates. She just came right over to me, didn't even say hello. She said, "I hope you're going to use my favorite hymn." My heart sank, and I said, "And what is that?" And she said, "A mighty fortress is our God." I sighed and I thought, well, that one's safe. Then, yielding to temptation, I said to her, "Seeing that it's your favorite hymn, I would be interested to know how much of it you can quote." So she started up, "Oh, a mighty fortress is our God. Da 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 da." So part of what she was telling me, that it was as much the music that she cared about as it was the text. And I've always felt that was a very significant encounter, because I found that to be true for many people.
Right. So starting with Hymnal 1982 and then moving forward with your hymn writing, how did that proceed after the project was finished?
Well, part of what happened after that is that many of us were doing road shows introducing the hymnal at various places all over the country. And that was really wonderful because we had the opportunity both to celebrate the things that people had not, the things that people were familiar with, and the things that people had not known. And so many of the things that were new to the hymnal at that point were embraced so heartily. I remember when I was in parish ministry, before I came to the Hymn Society, there was a time when I asked people, especially we used to try to schedule favorite hymns during the summer months. So I asked for people to list favorite hymns, and I was really touched by the fact that a number of the ones that they listed as favorites, they would never have sung before the 1982 hymnal. They were brand new to that hymnal. So some of these were very quickly and heartily embraced, and that was very encouraging to the people who had put that book together.
So I wonder if we could talk about the Hymn Society now a little bit, because it was not long after that then that you became executive director of the Hymn Society.
Right.
And can you talk a little bit about how that happened and what it was like to?
I had been on the executive committee, so I had already some glimpses of organizational and other kinds of concerns for the Hymn Society. Of course, I thought Tom Smith would be executive director forever, and it came just at a point when I was dealing with, what do I do next with my life, and it really did seem like the right thing, and fortunately, the Hymn Society agreed, and the possibility of taking the Hymn Society offices to Boston University School of Theology was very significant because Linda Clark, who was then in charge of the Master of Sacred Music program there, was someone who had done a lot of work on the importance of congregational song to faith formation. And so obviously she was a very sympathetic and supportive colleague there. And also the fact that there was already a substantial hymnological collection in the library was another important thing. So it was a very congenial place for the Hymn Society to be for the 13 years that it was there. And I continue to be grateful for all the support we received during that time. It was also a good place from which to, partly because it was the School of Theology, I didn't just have Master of Sacred Music people in the hymnology course. I also had people who were preparing for ordained ministry. And I was especially glad to be able to provide some sort of hymnological background for those people. One of my favorite experiences was a student who came in literally kicking and screaming that he is having to take this course because his advisor made him take it. And by the end of the course, he said, "I now believe this is really important." Yes, it is. So I was very glad for those experiences.
I have met an awful lot of your students who are, very deeply involved in the Hymn Society. I assume in large part because of your influence, but your students are making an impact all over the United States and Canada because of what they've learned from you.
Well, I did notice the other day that I have 3 former students on the executive committee, which is sort of amazing.
That is pretty amazing. Yes, and it's significant, very significant. You know, one of the things that occurred to me was that you, following Thomas Smith, he was the first paid executive director, full-time executive director of the Hymn Society, and then you were number two. I think, you know, it's always difficult to follow someone who's been in the job for a long time, and especially if they were sort of the very first person in that job.
Right.
I wonder if that how that was for you.
Well, Tom essentially created the job by what he did, and he did an awful lot. And in fact, in some ways, I think he created a culture in which people thought they didn't have to do anything because Tom would do it. And so part of what happened, especially during the time I was in the position, is we tried more and more to involve the executive committee all along rather than just at times of meeting. And this was just in the beginning of the stages of electronic communication. I blush now to think how primitive our first website was. But it did mean that we were beginning to be able to use email back and forth. And that helped a lot with being able to keep communication going. And more and more, we were able to take advantage of those kinds of developments.
Now, of course, the Hymn Society also underwent a lot of change during your time. I mean, there's some important turning points, I think, in the history of the Hymn Society during your time, like the meeting at Vancouver.
Right, Vancouver was very important because in some ways it was like a cold turkey experience for a lot of Hymn Society people to be at a conference where we never used the organ. And I did a lot of singing in styles of music that we had never encountered before. It stretched us an awful lot, but it also encouraged us mightily to find that there was so much additional music from around the world that, to a large extent, North American churches had not really tapped into yet. And it became evident at that conference in 1999 that from then on, we were going to have to pay more attention to these kinds of music that we had not known about. One of the benefits of that conference is that we were learning about this music, not at secondhand, but at firsthand, from people who were practitioners and in some cases, the originators of this music from places like Taiwan and Zimbabwe and Argentina. And so we were really being nourished at the font of these movements from around the world.
Who were those people?
Well, Ito Lo from Taiwan, Patrick Mazzacanieri from Zimbabwe, and Pablo Sosa from Argentina. And they each of them was a very different person, but each remarkably creative, and particularly in the case of Ito Lo, so incredibly well informed about a great repertoire of Asian material that we had hardly known about. And it was, one of the things I learned from Ito Lo was that he was doing work with materials from a culture in Taiwan that used syllables that were not words. They just sang things like ah or or other syllables that did not have any kind of denotation about them, but were really just a kind of expression of sound. And it made me appreciate how much sound, just making a sound, is a part of expressing something, especially when you think about what it says in Romans about with sighs too deep for words. Sometimes we even need to sing without words, so that this is just an example of how creative and stimulating it was for us to encounter these people. And we were at a wonderful site in Vancouver because on the campus of the University of British Columbia, there is a kind of meeting house that's derived from First Nations cultures. And so we were surrounded by this, in this big room with totem poles and other kinds of things that are outside our experience. And it reminded us of how we were on the edges of what was familiar. But it was a wonderful conference. Furthermore, the smoked salmon was wonderful.
Well, it's interesting, that all three of those leaders were eventually recognized as fellows of the Hymn Society. And of course, both Patrick and Pablo have died within just the past couple of years. But at this summer's conference, Michael Hahn is going to be conducting an interview with Ito Lo as part of our conference. And just 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was at the North American Academy of Liturgy, and Lim Sui Hong presented a paper. It's actually a chapter of a forthcoming book on liturgical theology, but they're approaching it from the liturgical theologies of various figures. And he wrote on Ito Lo, the liturgical theology undergirding the music of Ito Lo, and his approach to music was just fascinating. And part of it is what you're talking about. The sound is an integral part. And this is kind of a theme of our conversation today, actually, is that the sound is integral to the experience of how singing connects us to God.
Well, it really, in hymn writing, it should factor into word choice too, to work for words that are capable of being sung, where the meaning and the sound cohere rather than going off in different directions. One of the challenges of writing in English is that our language is such a polyglot language in many ways because it draws on various sources. And so there's usually more than one way to say things. So you can say, shut the door, or you can say, close the door. And each of those words, shut is such a, fricative word. And then you come, close has a little bit of a diminishing quality at the end of it, not like the hard T of shut. And so just choosing between two words that mean the same thing can make a difference in how a line goes together in a hymn text. And so you always have to listen to the words, not just look at the words.
Well, I'd love to talk about this for a long time. I was thinking about how in the most recent translation of the Roman Missal into English, there was a deliberate effort to choose more Latinate vocabulary as opposed to Anglo-Saxon vocabulary. And the implications of that, I guess, are just enormous. And
I did a session for Anthony Ruff at Collegeville, sort of debating what was coming up in the 2011 Missal, because it elevated the nature. in trying to be Latinate, you can't be Latinate and English at the same time. They don't cohere. They go off in different directions. And what is natural to say in English is not a natural thing to say in Latin. So anyway, I could go on that.
Yes, I don't want to sidetrack us, but let me take us in another direction. One of the conferences that was held during your time as executive director was in Winston-Salem.
Oh,
and
yes.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that experience.
That was actually the largest conference during the time I was executive director. May have been the largest yet, because we have something like 403 people registered. And the theme of that conference was celebrating the local voice in congregational song. And so we were trying to focus on things that were local. Well, we had the great benefit there of having it be one of the headquarters of and centers of Moravian song. And the Moravian singing tradition is always so marvelous to be a part of. One of my favorite sayings, in fact, is by a Moravian bishop whose name I don't remember, but he said, if we don't sing it, we don't believe it. And there's a lot of truth in that, that in order for things really to be part of our deep spiritual life, we need to sing them. But one of the things that the Moravians did for us, because we were there in July, is that they recreated their marvelous Easter morning service for us. Now, part of what this meant is that we had to get all those hymn society people on a bus at 6:30 in the morning. I was not looking forward to that, and I wasn't sure it was going to happen, but it did. People were wonderful. And so we got to the church, we go in the church, we have the first part of the service in the church, and then we go down the street with the Moravian brass bands on either side of us. It felt like the Israelites coming out with the water of the Red Sea on each side of them. And we go down to the cemetery at the end of the block, and we have an Easter service there in the cemetery. And it really makes a difference to sing about resurrection in a context like that. Really memorable. Another thing that was memorable about that conference was that we had what we called the progressive hymn sing. It was a dinner and hymn sing. And so we went to a series of 4 different downtown churches, all within walking distance of each other. And we started at one church and had hors d'oeuvres. And then we went into the church proper, and the choir would sing something, and then we would join them. And in almost every one of those churches, when the hymn society joined in the singing, it was you could see all the choir members go, "What was that?" It was like they'd never heard a congregation sing like that. And so we had hors d'oeuvres in one place, and a salad in another, and the entree in another, and then for dessert we went to the Episcopal Church and had Compline. And it was a marvelous evening. It was a marvelous evening. And we learned so much about the slight variations in what kinds of hymns were important to various congregations. And I don't think there was any overlap. They hadn't checked with each other, but there still wasn't any overlap. We didn't all just sing, "Oh God, our help in ages past." And it was a chance once again for us to learn from other people. And that's one of the great benefits of a hymn society conference is we can learn so much.
I was thinking that very thing, actually, as you were telling that story, that one of the things we do is we invite others to to create experiences then to which we sort of immerse ourselves, right, at these conferences. And I think you just, two descriptions of those things at Winston-Salem, very illustrative. There have been a lot of interesting comments in the chat, but I just did want to, people are mainly chatting with each other, but one of the things I thought was really interesting, Jackie Jones said a turning point in her life was when she received an email from you saying, you should consider joining the Hymn Society. And I think that's also illustrative of the kind of impact the Hymn Society has in gathering people who all have these various perspectives on hymn singing, and you just throw them all into a room together. And not only do they make wonderful sound together, but they certainly enrich one another. It kind of goes back to how you created your first hymn, but it's sort of in a larger scale.
Well, one of the things I love at Hymn Society meetings, we'll sing something, and the Baptist standing next to the Roman Catholic says, I'm so glad we sang one of our hymns. And the Roman Catholic says, I thought it was one of our hymns. And the Methodist will say, I thought it was one of our hymns. The Lutheran would say, I thought it was one of our, because we all have the hymns in common. Yes. And we haven't known that as much as we should.
Well, Stephen was good enough to point out to me that I hadn't looked at the questions and answers, and there are actually a couple of questions. Do you mind if I present them? Okay. So for Milner Seifert, can you please tell the story about saving the tune of Jerusalem for Hymnal 1982?
Well, this is another story very like the one about Bridegroom, because the tune Jerusalem, which is widely sung in England, is almost like a second national anthem to the Blake text, and did those feet in ancient time, etc. Well, it's such a wonderful tune that people love singing it, even with words that don't pertain. People at boarding schools in the United States have been singing Jerusalem for generations, even though they're about England, they're not about North America. And so about the same time that the Tunes Committee was coming to the text committee saying, we need a text that will go to the tune Jerusalem, the text committee had received a request from the Episcopal Peace Fellowship for a new peace hymn. And so, one of the challenges of life is the danger of having done something successfully on a committee and having written like the Murmur. They said, okay, Carl, you did a good job with that last one. Here, take this tune and this issue of peace and go write a hymn that takes care of both of these requests. And so that was also daunting. And again, I played it over and over. I was getting nowhere, just beating my head on the wall. And so I decided to give up and look at some of the books that had been piling up on my desk that I've been intending to read. And one of those books was by the late dean of the School of Theology at Sewanee, Terry Holmes. And I was only into that book about 25 pages or something. And lo and behold, there is a quotation from Isaiah. Then shall the wolf dwell with the lamb, and all that wonderful chapter of Isaiah. And suddenly it occurred to me, that's what I need to be writing about in this hymn. And so once again, the end of the hymn came first, because the second stanza of O Day of Peace is the dream, the fulfillment of the dream of peace. And so the first stanza then became our situation of longing for peace. And then the second stanza becomes what it's like to experience peace. So once again, the music came first. And in fact, it's a tricky piece of music to try to write for, because Perry had done such a good job of following the stresses of Blake's poetry that trying to write something else with the same stresses was a challenge.
Well, that text is another just incredible contribution to our life as Christians in the English-speaking world. You know, in our denominational hymnal, interestingly, that text appears with a different tune. It's a Scottish tune that I can't think of the name offhand, but
Ye Banks Embrace, is it Ye Banks Embrace?
I think so, right? Da, 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 da,
Yeah.
Which it conveys something a little different, doesn't it?
Yeah,
The
right.
tune does,
Well,
but
I love to see what a difference it makes to put different text with different tunes. When we were doing our various road shows for the Hymnal 1982, one of the things that Alec White used to love to do, when people were complaining that some tunes got moved around, one of the texts that did not get moved over into the 82 hymnal was "Once to Every Man and Nation," because we had theological problems with the text and people were complaining. And Alec pointed out to them what they really missed was the music, not the words. And so he showed them how important it was. So he had them sing "Once to Every Man and Nation" to the usual tune for "What a Friend We Have in Jesus." and as someone says, that just becomes a closer waltz with God. And then he had them sing "What a Friend We Have in Jesus" to the Ebenezer tune. What a friend we have in Jesus. He says, that's a different kind of friend, isn't it? Because when you change the music, you change the text. And so that's another one of those experiences that stuck with me.
let me we have another question here, and that is, what do you see as current gaps in research that could be fruitful for emerging scholars of hymnody to explore? And this is from Christian Kohler, who is a student at Boston University School of Theology right now.
Right. The gaps in our knowledge, and I'm still finding the gaps in my knowledge, are so great because we don't often understand the context out of which the texts have arisen. So if you go back and try to recreate the milieu out of which a hymn grew, it will tell you a lot about what you don't know and what we need to know more about. I mean, just reading through a hymnal companion gives you a lot of information about context that you didn't know about. But what about the songs that people were singing that we don't sing anymore? What was the significance of those hymns and songs that we are not singing anymore? Because the thing is, it's not that we have lost that faith, it's that we have learned to express it a different way, and trying to find the correlations between how people express things in the past and how we do it now is, I think, one of the kind of threads that a historical kind of scholarship can call attention to. For example, it used to be enough to celebrate women in the home, but we now realize that's not all there is to how we celebrate women or any kind of person. And so how do we connect what was praised at the former time with what is praised now? How do we connect what was thought to be an adequate understanding once before with what we regard as adequate now? How do we find that shift taking place? That's just one of the kinds of things I think needs more attention, because we have a really mistaken sense of newness if we think we have invented things now. Mostly we have just restated them rather than invented them. But there's so much that I find in older hymns that is full of insight, even when the way it's expressed is not what we would consider appropriate now. So there are all kinds of things we are missing out, I think.
Thank you. One of the things that I admire about your work is the way you help us to connect the dots among various factors that are involved in the things that we sing. Of course, your work on Glory to God has certainly helped us to appreciate a lot about various hymns. But I also wanted to mention the introduction that you wrote for the collection Songs for the Holy Other, which helped provide a theological base for that collection, and it's just really so helpful, and helps, I think, broaden people's understanding of why we need a collection like that. So thank you. I have one more question before we wrap up, because we are sort of coming up to the end of our hour. I think, as we come to celebrate our 100th anniversary as the Hymn Society, I would be eager to know, what is your fondest hope for the future of the Hymn Society as we move forward?
Well, I would say that my fondest hope is that the Hymn Society will help to continue to keep the song with the people. The congregation is the real locus for song in the church. For a while, we let choirs take that away from us. And ironically enough, now, even in some of the more evangelical situations, we've gotten back into a situation where the praise team does all the singing for the service. And the congregation really has no voice of its own, either because they are never given the chance to sing, or because they're drowned out by over-mic'd lead singers. Everything we can do to get the voice of the people back, and lively, and that it again should be an energy for faith formation for those who sing. Our motto when we were doing the Hymnal 1982 is that we should be able to give people an opportunity to sing what they believe and to believe what they sing. And I think that is the role of congregational song, is to help people know what they believe and to help them put their belief into action. And there will never, alas, or thank goodness, never be an end to needing to do that. So there's always going to be a need for people who foster congregational song.
Well, thank you for that. I am going to stick in one more question, because David Lee from England is on this, and he said, "I see on your bookshelves, I see Robert Alter's recent translation, Hebrew Bible. Does his astute observation of language influence your hymn writing since then?"
Oh yes, actually, my big project right now is finishing up a metrical paraphrase of the entire Psalter, and all along in that process, I've had Robert Alter's Psalms in one hand while I write with the other, because he is so insightful. And I have been so, for example, in the first Psalm, we usually translate a word as those who meditate on God's law. And Robert Alter points out that in the Hebrew, the root of that word is really the same root as the word murmur, those who murmur God's law. Because in ancient cultures, everything was spoken. Prayer was spoken, reading was spoken. And so to read and meditate is to murmur the word of God. And that brings us back to the importance of sound in our understanding of our connection with God. And so I was able to get the idea of sound into that paraphrase because of Robert Alter. So yes, I'm a great fan.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for this time together. This was really delightful. And the chat has pointed out to so many people have attested to the kind of encouragement that you've offered them personally, the influence you've had on them as students. But as a result, your influence really on all of us has been just enormous, and you're so gracious in sharing it. So, Carl, thank you so much for everything. It's good to be with you, and thanks all of you for joining us today. I hope you'll join us again next month when we'll be continuing our series. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.